Today, we're going to continue with our discussion of the Cold War, looking at some elements of both foreign and domestic policy. And of course, no global struggle against communism could be complete without another Red Scare. And so, similar to the first Red Scare, which of course happened in the aftermath of World War One, we have a second Red Scare happening in the aftermath of World War Two. There's some clear similarities between these Red Scares, but also some really important differences. So I'd encourage you now to go back and take a moment and look at some of the notes from the previous Red Scare, to look at the catalysts, some of the effects, and sort of why that Red Scare happened and how it unfolded, because this one's going to be in some ways similar and in some ways different. Whereas the first Red Scare was started by bombings and violence from communists and anarchists, and in general, the victory of the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union. The second Red Scare was started by the idea of Soviet spies. The Soviets had a very, very complex spy network, and they were incredibly effective at infiltrating both the American government and then also, especially, our spy agencies, which would be really problematic for the United States throughout the Cold War. So what's going to kick off this Red Scare is a guy named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was, as it says here, Democratic state official, convicted of passing government secrets or accused of passing government secrets to the Soviet Union. He was prosecuted by a young lawyer and congressman from California, a guy named Richard Nixon, who's going to become important here very shortly. We still really don't know the extent to which Hiss was guilty. He wasn't in general, or he was accused of perjury, but as always, or convicted of perjury, I should say. But as always, as you start digging into these issues, you start uncovering a variety of different layers, which make the whole incident somewhat more complicated. The biggest problem, of course, what they discovered is that the Soviet Union, one of the reasons why they were able to develop the atomic bomb so closely after the United States is the Soviet Union had spies within our atomic agency. And so, even within the Manhattan Project, creating this sense that, like, if the Soviets could infiltrate this top secret government weapons program, where would Soviet agents not be able to infiltrate? And so, this brings us to the Rosenbergs. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Julius was 100% guilty of passing secrets to the Nazis. Ethel was 100% guilty of being married to Julius, and both of them were convicted of spying for the Russians and were executed. So we know for a fact that there absolutely were Russian agents who were infiltrating the top levels of the US government, and there were Russian spies in the United States. The United States reaction to this was pretty dramatic. For example, we had made communists with the McCarran Act. We had banned communists from carrying passports, from serving in government. We had communists have to register with the U.S. government, and in order to serve in a number of different places, you had to take a loyalty oath, including teachers. For example, teachers would have to take a loyalty oath saying that they were not members of the Communist Party. So we basically outlawed communism, at least official communist public life. Then you get a guy named Joseph McCarthy, and the whole thing really turns on him. Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin, and he is going to make some broad, sweeping allegations that he has secret evidence that there are hundreds of communists hidden within the US government, that they've infiltrated every layer of our government, and that specifically the federal government is completely controlled by, or at least not completely controlled, but is significantly compromised by communists. He would provide no actual evidence for this, but this kicks off an era called McCarthyism, where broad accusations were being made against people suspected of being communists, and then they would be prosecuted and brought in and questioned and accused, with the idea being that if they admitted that they were a communist and pointed to their other communist sympathizers, they would generally get a lighter sentence than if they refused to admit that they were a communist. That was seen as absolute proof that they were a communist. Because you know who doesn't admit that they're communists? Communists. So we created a number of different government agencies. One, the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, which would pull suspected communists in front of them. They would question them and ask them who their communist associates were. The FBI would also investigate these people, and then employers would begin blacklisting you if you were accused of being a communist. A blacklist is you're fired and you're not hired from any other in any other sort of business in your industry. So the accusation of being communist became absolutely toxic, and it was used by a whole range of people to push a series of agendas. And of course, admittedly, there were a lot of people who believed that they were trying to root communism out of the United States. So it wasn't just opportunism. That was an element of it. There was also legitimate fear. But for example, in Hollywood, a series of Hollywood producers were blacklisted for suspected communist sympathies, despite the fact that there wasn't really any evidence proving that they were communist. There was this sense that, like, communist producers in Hollywood are sneaking secret messages into our films to turn our children into communists. And so they fired these ten Hollywood producers, and they were banned from working in the industry. Arthur Miller was famously he was the author of The Crucible, of course, and he was blacklisted during this time period for suspected communist links. We also targeted education, censoring textbooks, trying to find, with some teachers tend to be leftward leaning anyway. And so there was this sense that, the communists were infiltrating our education system and trying to turn the children into socialists and communist sympathizers. And so we'd censor education curriculum, textbooks, things like that, make sure that we were clearly trying to cut out communist influences from education. And in general, it just led to abuses, which, admittedly, probably unearthed and found some communists, but in the end ended up wounding a bunch of innocent people. What ended up finally bringing McCarthy down is when he targeted the army. McCarthy then, once he had everyone's attention, started alleging that not just the U.S. government was infiltrated with communists, but the army. And so he started calling up army officers and screaming at them and accusing them of being communists. And whereas the communist hearings were able to intimidate some Hollywood producers, the army more or less refused to cooperate. A lot of these hearings were televised, and as the U.S. public, as the public at large, saw McCarthy basically like throwing out completely unproven allegations, and the army just sort of sitting there being like, "Seriously?" The most famous moment was he was accused. The famous speech was, "Have you no sense of decency?" And so, with this sense that, the fact that McCarthy was revealed to be basically a charlatan, and that his list of hundreds of communists in the State Department was completely fabricated, he would fall from power, and the Red Scare would sort of peter itself out. But the lasting effect of this is this idea that communists are infiltrating the United States. This continued to be sort of a popular public sentiment, and strong anti-communist sentiment continued in the United States throughout the Cold War, and to some extent to today. So this helpful pamphlet was issued by the Timken Roller Bearing Company of Ohio, and you should absolutely pause this video and read it. It provides a lot of useful information about how to spot communists, what to do once you've found them. So Harry Truman was politically toxic, and at this point, there was no chance of him running for re-election. The Republicans nominated war hero Dwight D. Eisenhower. As honestly, Eisenhower was the chosen candidate of either party. He chose to run as a Republican, but it was very much a Zachary Taylor. Both parties want you to be their nominee, and whichever one you choose, you're probably going to win. He put Richard Nixon as his vice presidential candidate, of course, as a young up and comer, a fighter against communism, and much more what was seen as much more of a politician, to sort of balance out the fact that Dwight was a general. And obviously, the goal is to get the Truman administration out and sort of end all these New Deal socialist reforms and put the United States back sort of on the footing before World War II. The Democrats nominated a guy named Adlai Stevenson, who was a less than inspiring candidate. Probably the most famous moment for Adelaide was he was filmed here before a debate with a shoe that had a hole in it. And so he tried to use this as a campaign slogan in order to demonstrate how he was a common man, and he was working real hard to travel across the country and worn through his shoe. And uh, yeah, and that, I don't know. It's less than inspiring. And the end result, of course, is Republican sweep, with the exception of the Deep South, which is still mostly voting against Abraham Lincoln. Dwight Eisenhower was able to sweep the vast majority of the other states, 83% of the electoral vote, and is swept into office. Dwight Eisenhower's domestic agenda is much more modest than you'd see from any of the Democratic presidents. We don't have any sweeping programs, there's no Square Deal, New Deal, Fair Deal, any of this stuff. Eisenhower, in many ways, the Eisenhower administration represented a return to normalcy. Eisenhower played a lot of golf. He was a very savvy sort of foreign policy operator. But as far as domestic policy, what we see is, I mean, we create the Atomic Energy Commission, and we start using atomic power to create nuclear reactors, which is, probably a better use for atomic power than creating massively destructive weapons. But we're going to see a vast scaling back of the role of the federal government under Eisenhower. We also create NASA because, of course, during Eisenhower's term, with the Soviets launched Sputnik, this first satellite. And to say that the United States utterly freaked out about Sputnik is a massive understatement. The Cold War was, of course, a global fight between communism and capitalism. And so the idea that the communists are able to put this object into space, which is something that we were not able to do at this point, was clearly very troubling to Americans. And so NASA, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration, was created in order to try to help us compete in the space race. And we would re emphasize education, specifically STEM education, to make sure we didn't fall too far behind the. Whereas the Eisenhower administration, in some ways, represents a scaling back of domestic policy, foreign policy is where it gets incredibly complicated. And so I'm going to try to oversimplify this in a way that makes sense, but I'll put some links to help you through a number of these different crises. So the Eisenhower Doctrine is the is Eisenhower's foreign policy, basically his guiding platform in foreign policy, and it basically extends the Truman Doctrine out to other places. The main issue that Eisenhower had to deal with was the Middle East. So, for example, there was a lot of tension in the Middle East over, the creation of Israel, which we're going to spend some time talking about later. So, Israel's existence in the Middle East created a lot of tension. But the main issue is this whole like three worlds thing. So Truman was mainly focused on containing communism in Asia and in Europe, whereas the Eisenhower Doctrine, the goal is to contain communism as what's called the third world. During the Cold War, we had this three worlds model for the world. The idea that the first world is the capitalist democratic world, the second world is the dictatorial communist world, and the third world is everyone else. And so, to some degree, the Cold War is a battle between the first and the second world to try to convert slash recruit the third world onto your side. And so Eisenhower's goal was to try to prevent the Soviets from expanding their territory, while at the same time expanding our spheres of influence into these places in the third world. So, to tell a bunch of really complicated stories far too simply, we're going to look at the Middle East and Latin America. In the Middle East, we're starting to see the rise of secular dictators. So, guys like Gamal Nasser of Egypt. He was a nationalist leader who tried to sort of navigate the Cold War by playing the Soviets and the US off each other. So, Nasser, Nasser, or AR, I believe. For example, when he wanted to fund a dam on the Nile River, the Aswan Dam, he first went to the Americans for funding, and we offered them some money, and then went to the Soviet Union and said, well, the Americans offered us this much money, and so the Soviets then offered more money, and then he'd go back to the Americans, and he'd sort of use this in order to gain aid from both sides, with the idea that both sides were, of course, trying to keep Egypt within their sphere of influence. He would play one side off each other in order to secure benefits for Egypt and independence. This was most dramatically done in what's called the Suez Canal crisis, or the Suez Crisis. So the Suez Canal was, of course, dug by the British and the French back in the age of imperialism, controlled by them. So it's their version of the Panama Canal, incredibly important because it connects the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, blah, blah, blah. And so what ends up happening is Nasser seizes control of the Suez Canal. Then England and France and Israel simultaneously invade and occupy. Nasser, of course, realizes that he can't fight all these Western powers without help, so he calls up the Soviet Union and asks them to send aid, and so the Soviets start mobilizing to potentially invade Egypt. And of course, this is the last thing the United States want, because if the Soviets invade Egypt, one, it might cause World War III, and two, if the Soviets get into Egypt, it's going to become communist, and there's no way, there'll be no way to get them out. And so Eisenhower calls up Western powers and basically forces them to back down in the Suez Crisis, and Egypt is able to seize control of the Suez Canal. So this is just one way that savvy leaders play off the Soviet Union and the United States in order to get benefits for themselves. In Iran, we saw a very different story. The Iranians elected a secular socialist named Mohammad Mossadegh as their president, and this freaked out both the United States and England. It freaked out England because they had massive oil reserves in Iran and they were worried that Mossadegh was going to nationalize them. It freaked out the United States because, of course, he's a socialist and so he might have closer ties with the Soviet Union. And so a joint British and American coup, joined with hardline Islamist elements who didn't like Mossadegh's socialism, to overthrow Mossadegh and re-put in place the Shah of Iran, who was an autocratic leader who held control with a brutal secret police. And so the Shah is going to rule Iran for another about 30 years, and it's going to lead to massive resentment within Iran against the Westerners for interfering in Iranian affairs. At the same time, the United States is getting involved in Latin America. We're going to overthrow a Guatemalan government because it was slightly too socialist. But the main place in which we fail in Latin America is, of course, Cuba. Cuba, as we remember, has been a U.S. protectorate back since the Spanish American War. They had a series of somewhat democratically elected quote unquote presidents who were increasingly autocratic. And of course, all of this oppression eventually led to the Cuban Revolution and the overthrow of the Batista government by Fidel Castro. Castro used guerrilla tactics to overthrow the Batista government, and then very quickly, to prevent some sort of counterinsurgency against him, he cozied up to the Soviet Union. Here he is getting felt up by Nikita Khrushchev, who we'll talk about in a minute. And so now we've got a potentially communist government running an island, 90 miles off the coast of the United States, which of course was incredibly problematic for us. And so one of the challenges that Eisenhower's successors are going to have to deal with is what the heck do we do with Cuba? The other problem is Vietnam, because the vacuum of the Japanese occupying their territorial mandate in northern Vietnam led to the rise of sort of a Vietnamese nationalist independence group known as the Viet Minh, led by a guy named Ho Chi Minh. He, along with some sort of deserters and remnants of the Japanese army, carried on a fight against the French, whose puppet state, or who was still controlling a South Vietnamese puppet state. And what we had is sort of a pseudo Korean War type thing in South Asia. So you've got this in the north, it's mostly controlled by Vietnamese nationalists, and the south is controlled by French collaborators. So, by French collaborators. And so the end result of all this is the French lose a climatic battle called Dien Bien Phu to the North Vietnamese, and they start to withdraw. And so, with France no longer able to support the South Vietnamese government, the United States begins to step in and provide them with aid. And so, this is sort of a long process. We're not sending troops to Vietnam yet, but it's important to understand that during the Eisenhower administration, the US government was supporting the South Vietnamese. And yeah, in the Soviet Union, massive changes are happening, especially after the death of Stalin in 1952. With the death of Stalin is the rise of a guy named Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev is very different from Stalin. He was clearly he was a worker. He was from a peasant family, and he rose sort of through the ranks of the Soviet Communist Party to become their supreme leader. And he is going to try to make the Soviet Union into a much less terrifying place than it was under Joseph Stalin. They're going to go through a period that's called de-Stalinization, where they sort of back away from some of the harshness of Stalin's communism. And this is going to lead to a thaw in relations to the United States. The Soviet Union and the communist world is going to become more open. This is None of this is more apparent than in the opening of the first grocery store, the first supermarket in Yugoslavia in the 1950s. The supermarket was an American invention. This idea that you could go to one place to get all of this food, and so it will totally change the way people shop for groceries. And they were starting to open up these supermarkets in the Soviet Union as the Soviets were sort of trying to westernize some elements of their society. Nowhere is this more apparent than the famous kitchen debate. The Vice President Richard Nixon went to Moscow to go to a display of American consumer appliances. So here he is sharing a Pepsi with Comrade Khrushchev. I'm going to post clips of the kitchen debate. It's absolutely amazing. You should 100% watch it. And so it seemed for a while like, in general, things were going to be somewhat peaceful between the two worlds. But of course, it was not to last. The U-2 crisis, and I'm going to post a video about this too, broke down relations when a high altitude spy plane, we have been flying these U-2 missions, these high altitude spy planes with high definition cameras on the belly. We've been flying them over the Soviet Union and taking pictures, assuming that they flew too high and fast for Soviet missiles to reach, and it turned out we were wrong. Plane gets shot down, pilot is captured. We try to claim it's a weather craft. He admits to spying, and this leads to a massive international incident, painting the United States as less of a benign actor on the world stage and leading to increasing tensions that would ratchet up until we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk about, I believe, tomorrow. So, brief thaw. Seems like things are going to be somewhat more peaceful, and then tensions ratchet up, and we're back to staring at each other angrily across two oceans.